I made several notes during the presentations, as well as just kind of things that came up the top of my head before the session began. I guess the one thing, maybe we could start with, actually start with Kelly, in that order. There's a lot of stuff that was conveyed in the presentations this morning in terms of the things to take into consideration for science management. And I mean, you're sort of starting out in sort of building your scientific career. And from that, is there something you think would be like a good place to start in terms of getting that foundation set up to sort of start building a good science management practice, I guess, for your own research?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I came from this very, grad school tradition of doing everything yourself. You manage, but no one has ever taught you any skills to do it, right? You have these very hacky solutions to how you go about it. So I think to start, there are lots of formalized tools and techniques, and it can seem very overwhelming. But I would say identify one thing where you think implementing that tool or technique or knowledge would help you most. And for me, that was in the monitoring and closing processes. When I talked about those 5 kinds of processes that exist in project management, monitoring especially was something I barely ever did, even though I code a lot. And even in coding, you're supposed to comment on your code, right? And I would change things without commenting as to why or dating it or whatnot. And I would say those are simple things where if you identify in your own work where you can easily implement just a few small solutions, you can start building it from there because it becomes habit, right? And I think that's where we could start.
Anybody else want to add to that?
So I think one of my big learnings when I started to move away from academia and into sort of the non-academic, away from the bench, was reading basically just Project Management for Dummies. I mean, it sounds kind of mundane, but it actually really sort of helped frame the thinking around what are some of those basic project management skills and how can I apply those to research and or frame what I've done in a research world into terms around project management that make me more appealing to an outside organization.
I think one other thing to think about is what you're actually interested in, and if you're interested in something, there's probably a career opportunity within that. And I think one of the things that I hear from talking to people who are looking to transition is they ask what they should do to differentiate themselves from everyone else in their grad school program. And I would sort of flip that and suggest, what is it that you're doing that you think differentiates yourself? And when I realized that about myself was when I was doing my exit seminar, when I was preparing for my PhD defense, and instead of trying to convey the importance of my work to the faculty and my colleagues, I'd invited my 86-year-old grandmother who had no high school education, and my goal was to get her to understand my work. And that just came innately. And at the end of it, and she probably loves me, so she lied to me, but she said, to understand my work, she's like, your brain's made up of cells, and they talk to each other by spitting things at each other. So at that point, I realized that's something that I maybe have a knack to, and that's something that I've been able to deepen within my role within OBI. So I would just say, think about the things you're really interested in, and figure out how to sort of carve out a niche for yourself in that area.
Yeah, and the point I was going to make was very similar to yours, and I think an extension of that is take risks. I think you saw a wide variety of things that you can do and the specializations that you can take on. And I think the most interesting thing, while you have the opportunity, is take risk. Is it data management? Is it knowledge translation? Is it resource management or people management? So take those risks because you may not know what you're interested in, and the only way you're going to find out is taking a risk, taking an internship to figure out whether you're actually interested in it. Maybe data management is not for you, or whatever the case may be.
Great, thank you. I will be glancing out in the audience as we're having this discussion, so feel free to throw your hand up if you want to either ask a question or contribute to a conversation as it goes forward. I do want to make this as interactive as possible because this is for you after all. So, nobody? Okay. One of the other things that came up a couple times in the presentations today was the notion of partnerships. And partnerships in trying to provide sort of either the assistance in management or the training in management. So for example, Indoc is a good example of a company, not-for-profit, put in place actually to sort of support in some aspects of management. OBI as both a funding agency, but also in terms of facilitating relationships and trying to, you mentioned a great example of trying to pull together projects that required communication between clinicians and informaticians and basic scientists and so on, and actually was successful. It's a great success story. So I wonder if we could talk about that a bit more, because I think, again, the fear, if I sort of think back to what I was like when I was a young PI, hearing a talk like what we just had is like, there's no way I can do that and be able to run my lab and be able to teach and so on and so forth. So think about sort of the roles that, for example, industries and non-for-profits can sort of help support that. Maybe we can talk with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely, collaboration is a key aspect. And from a technology perspective, you know, we're a health technology company, and use cases drive a lot of the development that we do. So I think taking a look at collaboration as a way to alleviate that pressure that you have on yourself. Can you collaborate with a company like ours, or, you know, OBI funds a number of neuroinformatic interns where the training and the resources are actually provided by an industry setting. So we work with you, you say, what is your use case? You say, I have this large imaging data set that I want to be shared or whatever, and we build the project around you. So I think using those collaboration can actually help you alleviate that pressure, where you have people that have already done it, they have the resources, they have the know-how to help you not only get an output out of it, but also train somebody that's really good, that then you can come into your lab and continue moving different projects forward with that skill set.
And I think really, you know, thinking about partnerships in the context of, you know, playing to your strengths. You don't have to do it all. You can't do it all. So how do you partner with people who have other strengths that are different than the ones that you have, so that you can actually make your work more impactful? You know, I hated doing cell culture work. I really hated following a protocol, but I love being able to talk about the science and see how that feeds into the bigger picture. So, you know, understanding that these are my strengths, this is what I'm really good at, and finding people who are good at the things that you're not good at, so that your work can be, so that you can have more impact.
Yeah, so this is like what we've talked about before when it comes to relationship management. Is one of the key things in that whole process is to identify what are the needs and what are the resources that exist in the project. Like, how can you mix and match so that people don't have to do cell culture if they really, really hate following that protocol, right? Because this is in the benefit of everybody. Like, it's a win-win. You don't want to do something, you don't have to do it. Somebody else really likes it doing that, so they can do it. And at INCF, this is basically a large part of what we do, is that we mix people with projects where we have community members who have identified that we're missing this expertise or this tool or whatever, and then we find that person or that tool for them and connect them. And I think this is really one of the key things, besides data sharing, that is actually going to help move science forward at a faster pace than what it is today. We really need to learn how to collaborate better.
Just another, there's tons of funding opportunities as well. NSERC, CHR, OCE, they all have funding programs that are intended exactly for this, connecting academia with industry. As people that are looking for those opportunities, as students and postdocs, look for those opportunities, take them to your PI. MyTax is another example. So I think driving that, so what is your project, where's my source of funding? These are really obvious things, but you can do the groundwork so that, you know, your principal investigator or the company doesn't have to, and you bring this package that seems like a match made in heaven already.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I really appreciate the opportunity to, you know, come to these workshops and think about data management, human resource management. And I'm just wondering if there are practices that are in place right now for principal investigators to, like, how do we verify that they're also like going through these qualifications and just learning about this? Is it just a very hands-off approach? Is it you should do it, or should funding agencies or different bodies like really implement and hold them accountable that all of these research labs are actually, you know, following these very wonderful practices for
Yeah.
to make research more.
Did you all get that? Yeah, let's stop this.
Yeah, so I suspect that Mojib is going to want to talk about the data management part of that, but when it comes to like personnel management, resource management, other kinds of resources, I think one of actually the long-term plans that Tanya, who was mentioned earlier, who is not here because she's home with her little baby, one of our long-term plans with this was to actually try to put together some sort of best practices when it comes to science management, and in that is included resource management when it comes to staff and other things. And I do think that I don't really see an obvious sort of entity in order to enforce such a set of best practices. But at least when it comes to data management, both funders and publishers have started to put pressure on proper data management plans and also data sharing plans. But I'm sure Mojib has more things to say about that.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned Portage and the Tri-Council. Those guidelines the guidelines were released, 2015. So, programs that are directed at your institutions to train you are still under development, but there's resources online. Portage being a good one, there's other ones. So, if you search data management plans, there's actually multiple companies that are coming up in the US that help you create data management plans. But beyond that, there's resources. From a funding perspective, what we're seeing with collaborative research projects that we're going in with various investigators is that, NSERC and Canary and various funding bodies are actually now reserving an amount of funding, a certain percentage of their funds for project management. And when we're talking about data management, it's really project management in terms of data. So in the past, we've had dedicated resources, let's say, 5%, 10% of the grant for project management. So that, again, that's from a funding body, that's critical that trend is happening.
And it really goes back to the carrot and stick, right? So you can actually, as a funding agency or as some kind of organization, you could come in and say, you're going to do this. And that's probably not going to get you a lot of success. But if you say, here's why you should do this, and oh, by the way, we're going to create some specific funding opportunities for this, or we're going to provide some additional support, or those other pieces, there's carrots that you can put out there. And I think it's a couple of both. It's also, it has to come from the ground up, right? We've got PIs who've been in academia for a really long time and have survived the shift in science. And now there's the next generation. Randy's smirking at me. And there's the next generation. It's really the folks in the room here who are kind of laying the groundwork so that, when those funding opportunities come up and when those carrots come up, it's really sort of the next generation that can really stand to benefit and can champion those changes within their organizations.
There's a question down here.
Along those lines, are there any tips for managing up or managing as a player on the team as opposed to the coach of the team? Because many of us work for people who don't want to get on board with the new way of project managing science research. They like the whole floundering discovery approach.
So if I had a grant dollar for every time I used the term herding cats, I'd be fine until retirement. And I think for those of us who are managing up and managing across a lab or groups or collaborations, it's a huge challenge is differences in personalities, motivation, and motivating people to get on board. And I think we heard a lot of that today. And I think it requires, on the part of the manager, some intuition as to what best to do. So it's a more personalized technique to me to get to know each of our individual personnel. And, some people require persistent emails. Some people are better face-to-face. And so kind of changing up the ways in which you try to get people on board and motivate them is different across everyone. And sometimes that motivation is carrot, and sometimes it's stick, unfortunately, right? And that's really what's worked for me. It's still a work in progress, but I'm happy to hear what others have done.
Yeah, so when it comes to managing up, like you said it, I think it's, I'm going to quote Alan Alda again, it's important to use empathy, right? Because even though I would personally love to force open science on everybody, it's just not possible. It's a slow change. It is changing, but it's going slow. But you need to have some sort of understanding to how these people came to where they are today, and they didn't get there through open science, so they don't have the same understanding for that process. But I think by showing them how it works and that it's not a scary and dangerous thing and you're not going to get scooped around every corner, they will eventually come around as well. But it takes a lot of patience, and it's like Kelly said, you need to have a personalized approach and really try to be in tune with where they're coming from, and try to be open and steer them toward positive aspects of open science or whatever it is that you're wanting to convince them about. And I find that a lot of the times it's more the carrot than the stick, especially if you're talking about senior people. I mean, it's really hard to herd cats with a stick. I mean, if that's the other part of that saying, right? If you have the cat food, then it's easier to herd the cats. So. Yeah.
It's like Francis Collins once said, you can't herd cats, but you can move their food. And I think the point is there's new funding opportunities that are being created, and this is a way to broaden sort of the scope of an individual lab to look at these new opportunities. There's opportunities like SPORE about how to engage patients in meaningful patient-oriented research. And I think if these opportunities are broad as a way to sort of complement the portfolio of the lab's research, I think that these are really powerful ways, and it shows some leadership from the people that are bringing these opportunities forward, especially as funding becomes more and more competitive and these new funding streams are introduced, but they have strings, and these strings are the incentives to try to create researchers to take a different approach to their normal research process.
If I could just add a personal vignette, because I've sort of done it from both sides. When I was a grad student, the lab I worked in was very bad at sort of managing projects. And so I was sort of brought in an idea of at least tracking, you know, who's doing that experiment, how's the software getting curated, and so on. When I started my own lab, it was rather small. I had one RA and one grad student. And it grew quite dramatically after like Virtual Brain got funded, for instance. All of a sudden expanded to like 15 people within the matter of a couple of years. And it was really not my own initiative, but really the people that I was working with, like Tanya, like Kelly, who said, I have an idea. And they demonstrated that it actually would be better if we tried to adopt this sort of perspective. So it's actually showing that this would benefit not just me, but actually the whole research enterprise to do it this way. It takes a bit of time to set it up, of course, but then you just sort of show that if we use Trello, for example, to track a project, all of a sudden we know what's happening across the lab. Much more quickly we can make decisions. If we use Jupyter Notebooks, for example, for tracking the development of models and software, we can share that information across labs. It helps with legacy in terms of the lab. And that to me was sort of proof of the pudding that, oh, this actually works. And it's worth my time then to invest in both the personnel in the lab that are doing that as their primary operation, but also to support the technology going forward. And then I can take my experience as demonstration to other PIs who are similarly old and say, this actually worked for me. Maybe you guys should think about this as well. So there is benefits for actually just, like you say, using a carrot or moving the cat food around, as it were, to get them to move to where things look more delicious, as it were, going forward. Other questions? I have a sort of pointed question, which I think is going to loop back to some things we've been talking about already, but it also has to do with sort of how making sure people understand the impact of the science. And I can frame it in a very negative way, or I can frame it in a positive way. I think to be provocative, I have to do it as a negative thing. So is bad science management actually contributing to the perceived lack of scientific impact?
Probably yes.
Okay, good.
That's a tough one. And I think it's not having the resources and the expertise and the documentation that leads to that. So I think it's a pointed question, but I think it also indicates where we need to do better.
I'll be equally provocative and say impact is a hollow word that's meaningless in the same way that innovation is. It's hard to describe. So I think if you want to talk about having your research be impactful, you need to define exactly what that means. I think that comes back to my presentation is if we want to make research matter, who are you making it matter to? So who is being changed or impacted by that work? And I think that's how you more adequately define if your research is impactful.
Great point.
Are we all being tasked with this one?
If you want.
I think, I think it's about educating and training the next generation of scientists. Again, the landscape is changing. The knowledge and the amount of data that's been accumulated. I mean, I remember being in grad school and digging through boxes of research data that had just been sitting there, and there was so much information there. And if we could just empower people to be able to make better use of that data, I'm sure we can all relate to situations where as a graduate student or a postdoc or even as a PI, you're kind of looking back at a study and saying, oh, I wish I understood what those parameters were for that study, or I wish I had this data readily available because it could help me answer some of the questions that we're doing. So, I think it's about, again, educating and empowering the next generation of researchers to be able to do better.
I think changing the perception of how science is managed is going to change, I think, along with the open science push. And I think that is coming with the next generation, and that our graduate students and our trainees are really adopting this faster than we are, and especially the more senior PIs. So I think with open science comes the absolute necessity to have data management and science management. So I think that will all contribute towards changing the perception of how poorly science is doing or being managed.
And I think also you got to take a look at the examples I'm going to take from Jordan's, demonstrable small wins, right? You look at what OBI has done with brain code and on the data management side, right? That was a win. Not everything, from a management side may have been optimal, but there are wins there. The virtual brain, what INCF does. So there's wins there, and what can we learn from those wins, and what can we learn from those failures? That's what's going to lead to more impact.
We need more success stories. We need more talented writers to write up more success stories of the science that's actually successful and has a practical implication in society.
That's actually a good springboard. So what I was asking about is about communication, actually. And I don't want to say roles and responsibilities, but I actually kind of want to frame it in that context, in the sense that there is obviously a tension between communication of science by the PIs and how the communication is then carried forward. There's been some examples on Twitter recently where, for example, a colleague in Montreal gave an interview to a magazine about the research he was doing and was completely misinterpreted and put forward as if we have a cure for a certain affliction, which in fact was not the point of the paper at all. So I guess the question is like the responsibilities of the scientist in terms of the communication institution, and actually how to make sure that the communication is effective but is not sort of overselling things as well going forward.
That's a tricky one. I mean, being an ex-scientist and now a communicator, I have one foot on each fence of that whole thing. Like, well, the scientist should have final approval of a popular scientific text. And on the other side, it's like, well, we can't have scientists come in and rewrite our communications because that doesn't always come out in an easily digestible form, right? So the point of responsibility there, I think it's a really tricky one, because on the one hand, you need to let the communicator do their job because it is their job. And I know I say this all the time on Twitter especially, that communications is not something that's easy. That is a profession in itself. It's something that's taught and learned, and it's a skill that's acquired. It's not something that most people are just naturally good at. But on the other hand, what is being communicated needs to be accurate. We don't need people thinking that, we found a cure for Alzheimer's because somebody showed something in 14 mice, right? So I don't have a good answer to this, but it's a delicate balance between respect for the communication skills as an expertise, but also a need for fact checking, and somewhere I think there needs to be an approval by the scientist involved that this is actually what my study's shown.
That's a good point. It sort of speaks to this whole thing about marketing and hype and impatience, and I think that's kind of where we are. So you have to, in a way, sell science so that public sees the value of the public dollars that are going to fund it. And what resonates is this idea of cures. No one really talks about treatments or the incremental progress. But if we think back to things like the Human Genome Project, it didn't achieve its ultimate goal, which was to sequence the genome and understand and develop personal medicine. But there's all these other side benefits that came out of that. And I think we need to better emphasize that, because these aren't simple engineering problems. Like you talk about, like brain disorders, for example. We don't even really understand the brain, so we can't even begin to really develop effective treatments. Whereas if, say, like we can put a man on the moon, but we can't cure cancer. One's an engineering problem, one's purely discovery, and we're sort of figuring it out as we go along. There's always another layer of complexity, but I think we really need to emphasize the things that are coming out of it that are tangible and how that traces back to original research. And, there's that tension between selling the science and being accurate, and I don't have a good answer, but I think we just need to do a better job of being, all of us being accountable for the work that we're doing and why it's important.
So a comment or question, or both in the back?
Hi, yes. I think my question is more related to the previous topic, sorry, but it was about adopting project management as this excellent tool, and I've definitely had my fair share of projects where I've found a great plan, but I'm already halfway through a particular project. So, and kind of my learning in this area is ongoing. So do you think that it's feasible or advisable to kind of retrofit a project with a new data management plan after you've already dove in?
It's feasible, as is many other things. It does take an extra amount of work, and I have recently done this. I have some projects that are, I would say, legacy data, but we have recently posted it to an open database, and to do that, we had to get it into a standardized format and all the stuff that is really hard when you didn't start at the beginning with this in part of the initiation phase with the plan. It's doable, and I think it's about, in those cases, just identifying what needs to be done versus what would have been nice to have, at least for legacy projects.
Yeah, and I think it is feasible, and I think it is a good trial by fire, because you'll realize how hard it is to do it after the fact, but you learn about the standards, you learn about what you needed to do in order to achieve your end goal. And we deal with a lot of retrospective data, right? And harmonization is a part of that, right? Just because data wasn't collected with certain standards or with certain data management protocols doesn't mean that it's not useful, doesn't mean that it can't be mapped back. That's the whole concept of adopting ontologies, where we can map multiple data sets that were created at different times with different purposes and be able to analyze them together. So there are tools and there are resources, but it's definitely harder to retrofit a data management plan after your study has taken place. But I think it is good practice, because you learn quite a bit from that.
The last topic about that tension. And so what I see it as, this tension with the term, or I think it's a good one, with return on investment and the different stakeholders. So there has to be, and I don't have the answer, there has to be some way to say that if I do this particular experiment, this particular project, I'm going to get this result. And perhaps down the line, this may be useful to cure or whatever, and as scientists, we don't usually use the word cure, we don't use it loosely anyway. So I think that's where we sort of need to grow up and become better at communicating. But there is that tension there, because we do have policymakers and everybody, slashing funding because we don't see that outcome. But these in-between outcomes are extremely important. And I think that's the task that we're faced with right now, is how do we show the incremental return on investment and how important those are. Anyways, that's more of a comment. I don't have an answer, I'm sorry. I hope you guys
No, we don't. Actually, one of the things I can mention briefly, that there is now a trend, a good one, for pre-registration of experiments, particularly when there's a clinical aspect to them. So actually, you put forward what experiment am I going to do, what am I looking at, what disease, what's the cognitive process I'm looking at, for example. So that way, at least it's out there at the beginning, so you actually know what people are studying. And that could be something that could be more broadly adopted. And certainly, it's in the spirit of open science, in the sense of having not just the summary of the grant be available, but also what experiments are actually happening under that grant and what is the... Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think that the trend for pre-registration of experiments is actually getting to that direction, because it says these are the activities that we're undertaking under this research umbrella. And if this experiment goes the way I think it's going to go, this will be the impact of it. It's sort of done spotty right now. Most of it's in clinical trials, which makes sense, but also it can be adopted in just basic research as well.
Yeah, and I think the important point about that is following up and closing the loop, right? So, there's people who participate in clinical trials, and once it ends, they never hear anything else about it, whether it goes forward. One of the things that our research programs have done, which I think we're really proud of, is that we have patient advisory committees that surround the programs and a large patient community that's heavily invested. And these are the people that participate in the research studies. And every year, they all get invited to come together and have a more informal day with some of the researchers. And they can't talk about what they've learned about an individual, but they talk about as a cohort and how that's advanced their understanding of a disorder like autism or cerebral palsy. And I think just having that, closing the loop, that connection, that follow-up, that's something that I think is lacking in science right now. In an individual lab, I think that's hard to do, but I think there's probably ways that could be done. I think just really communicating back to the people that have been involved and invested, simple things like newsletters, Twitter's a good way to sort of communicate the results of things and have those discussions. So just really making sure that, it's not really just passive communication.
I thought that was an interesting point you made about sort of the incremental results and what they can lead to. And there's been an increased pressure on scientists in the last few years to do more science communication and to do more outreach, which is something that I'm not entirely agreeing with, because I think scientists should be allowed to do what they want to do, which is to do the science, right? And maybe not so much the outreach. But maybe that's actually where we can put the responsibilities on the scientists. Like what they need to do is to clearly communicate the incremental successes, right, and what that can lead to, but not maybe do the broad and very public outreach that they are sort of pushed to do to a greater extent these days.
And I think that also gets at the metrics, that the way we talk about return on investment. What are those metrics? And I think those are really changing, right? From just a purely data perspective, what your return on investment is. If you share your data, you have one publication, and then 3 other groups come up with 3 different. That should be a metric. You just serve additional publication purposes, right? But how is that tracked? How is that reported? That's a monitoring aspect. And do funders take that into consideration as well? That they gave you some money, you published one paper, but so there's 5 other groups. Right, so I think that aspect also needs to be looked at as well.
Other questions from the attendees? I have one more theme I want to try and touch on. That's sort of the end user engagement. I think a couple of people have talked about, for example, patients was brought up as one of the end users, obviously industry and I guess society in general. And are there sort of pragmatic or practical things we could think about in terms of how to engage our end users? Maybe talk about perhaps, patients obviously is one that's important. And I know, Jordan, you talked about it a bit. Maybe you can talk about that specifically, and we talk maybe about industry as well in terms of how do we engage end users in helping us manage our process going forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was most interesting when it was one of the principles of OBI is that we would be patient focused, and you hear that word thrown around a lot, but I think that we want to stay true to that, and the way to do that is You have to build respect initially, but I think that's too strong. I think you need to recognize that there's value of that lived experience to match with the clinical or research expertise. And at the very beginning, when our programs used to meet and have workshops, we said we want people, representatives from the patient community to be there. And the first reaction was, oh no, they won't understand anything that we're talking about. It's too confusing for them, which is probably true because they were probably talking about it at a high level. But at the same time, our research programs had people, brain imaging experts, geneticists, clinicians, basic researchers. And if they're talking in their usual language, their usual jargon, they're missing all of these other people they're supposed to be collaborating with. So by forcing people from the patient community to be there, it forced people to be lay and be thinking more big picture about the program, and I think that enabled communication. But I think the point was we had to get them to sort of recognize the value of this different experience. And it creates tension. At the very beginning, I think at one of our first workshops, one of our epilepsy researchers was talking about epilepsy and used the word, epilepsy can lead to severe mental retardation in some cases. And one of the mothers stood up and said, that's a horrible word. My child has been referred to being retarded his life, and I don't like that. And the researcher retorted back, well, what's a better word then? And they had a whole discussion. Well, delayed, is delayed appropriate? Delayed means they'll catch up. So it leads to these interesting tension, but it ends up leading to a common understanding and a recognition of the differences. And I think that's the point, is you need to create that opportunity or that environment for that to happen, that equal discussion. You need facilitators. You need to create lots of opportunities for exchange. And the key thing also is to create that opportunity to follow up. So these people are participating in the research. If you want them to be there with you long term, they need to hear back from you and they need to feel like they're actually part of it, as opposed to being brought in for some asymmetrical value that they can provide to research. There needs to be some tangible benefit that they're getting out of it. And in the 5 or 6 years that we've been doing this for, we have a lot of the same people that are heavily involved. They're not getting paid. We cover travel and their expenses to attend these meetings, but the real benefit they're getting is they feel like they're part of it. They feel like they're part of research as opposed to being participants. So I think that's sort of what I'd say about partnership.
I'm just going to build a bit on what Jordan was saying, because one of the things that we implemented through these workshops was something as simple as a so what slide. So every single presentation we had, the researcher or clinician or whoever was up there had to say, so what? And what was really cool to see is that, when you've got geneticists, imagers, clinicians, multidisciplinary teams in a room, all of a sudden they were understanding each other's science a lot better. And you could have some really interesting conversations about, the bigger goals, the bigger impacts, some really interesting questions that you could ask because you were understanding each other a little bit better.
And actually, one thing just to tag off of that, the other thing is important about that engagement is also they become advocates as well for your research. So a lot of what we talked about today in terms of the necessity for having some capacity to learn about management and science, some of that's free, some of it's not. And the question is, when we're trying to allocate resources to support science, we have to be able to support management in some framework. So whether it be partnerships with companies that help build a platform, whether it be partnerships with funding agencies to actually work together, would it be actually hiring people on staff whose title is as a project manager. Those are positions that are not traditional in the lab, but they have to be now, I think, to actually move science forward. So by having the end users engaged, they can actually be the advocates and say, yeah, you have to support this because they need that to actually make the science impactful and help me. So that's actually a very important feature in that loop.
Yeah, talking end user engagement, with what we do, our end users are actually researchers themselves, and them seeing results of, they invest the time to implement these standards or whatever the case may be, they become advocates, and that advocacy leads to adoption of those standards, that platform, and that sharing. And really, from a data management and data sharing perspective, the more people you have on board, it's almost like vaccination. The more people you have, the better your science is gonna get, because now we're pooling our resources instead of everybody just spending, some funds here and some funds there. Let's pool those together. So that user engagement to the researchers, you need to show them real benefits of what they have invested in as well.
This sort of ties into the work that INCF is doing with the standards and best practices as well, because what we're doing is not, the herding of the cats and everything else, like we all know how it works to impose this, or how, you know, when you try to impose a standard on scientists, that doesn't really work. You need to pull more people together. They need to agree that this is the best thing to use, and then that's the thing that you make a standard, right? Because it's not a standard if only 3 people are using it. So yes, pulling resources, getting people to agree on stuff is the way.
Great. Okay. Any questions or comments from the audience before we wrap things up today? Yeah.
Thanks for all of your talks. I think more and more we're starting to understand and recognize how the data that we collect and the way that we collect it, and even the way that we conceptualize our projects, can come with a lot of bias that just comes in from the way that we approach our work. And I'm thinking specifically even of ways that we code our data. So for example, how are we accounting for sex and gender? How are we thinking about how different communities prioritize who owns their data, who owns their knowledge? And I'm wondering kind of where you turn to or where you look for sources to fill in those blind spots, because we don't know what we don't know. And maybe some of the answer is partnerships. And I'm wondering sort of how you tackle that piece of the puzzle that sometimes we're missing.
I can recommend looking at an organization called Sage Bionetworks when it comes to patient data and who owns the data and that whole thing, because that's what they specialize in, Sage Bionetworks.
I think this is a great question, and I don't think we're tackling it enough. And when you say we don't know what we don't know, we really don't. And places where I have found inspiration are actually outside of science, our kind of science, and more towards looking at social sciences and their approaches, the things that they consider, and really like branching out and you know, like looking into things like feminist theory and things like that, and how we can start incorporating those ideas and at least planning and managing and monitoring our processes. That's the best I think that we're at. We're really at, I think, the very beginning stages of recognizing that this is even a problem.
There are enormous cultural differences as well, and also, you know, jurisdictional between. We had a discussion about Europe versus North America in terms of sharing information, and there's some challenges there. But I think the more that we acknowledge this is a problem, the problem that we need to address, the more likely there is to have some discussions around the table. I mean, my collaboration with Europe is actually going to face this problem very quickly, because we have patient data we want to share between Europe and Canada, and there's all sorts of issues around that. How to make sure that they can be shared so we can actually move things forward, but also being mindful of the privacy issues around sharing those data as well. It has to be addressed. I think if we're going to have impact, we have to address this head on instead of trying to ignore it. Yeah.
A question about knowledge translation, specifically the fact that we use them yelling. So we usually do knowledge translation with people who are either doing the research or care about the research. I feel like a lot of times we're not translating to people who maybe don't know what's even going on in the first place. And so I'm just curious if there are any initiatives that are looking into that. It seems like it's not the role of the researchers themselves, or maybe the institute. Is it government? Is it another organization?
I think this is tricky because you're not just competing with their attention for other research, you're competing with their attention in general. And I think you realize a lot of people know that science is important, but most people don't actually care about it. So yeah, I think the key thing is to identify champions within those worlds and be able to get to them. So, you know, a lot of our work is definitely facilitated by having some strong advocates for our work within government, within the patient community. Instead of having to create your own audience, you can tap into those people's audiences. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, a lot of our work we do through the provincial advocacy groups is we have not relationship with the advocacy group, but relationships with people there that we know, that trust us. And that creates that outlet for our work and the work of our researchers to then get to that broader audience.
So Jordan mentioned that it might take 17 years from the bench to the lab, which, to be honest, I don't think it's that much, considering that it might take 3 years to publish a paper. thousands of rounds of revisions or just one rejection if you're lucky. And then the high impact factor journals, most of them are not open access. And I think almost all of you talked about open research. So my question to all of you, because I really want your opinion, is how can we fix academia? Because there are so many flaws, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone. I am in academia, I'm a PhD student, and open access, great, yes, but then you don't publish in Nature. If you don't publish in Nature, then you don't get funding. I know that it's not black or white, but there are so many issues like that, how can we address them? What can we do, the young generation?
Start small. You're not going to change the world overnight. You know, we're starting to have more of these conversations, and you know, it's not going to happen overnight. But we need to talk about the problems, think about how we can fix those problems, and again, start small. You know, we're not going to do a complete overhaul on the publication system, but you know, you are starting to see journals coming out that are open. The publishers are starting to talk about this. So we just need to continue to build on those quick wins, those small wins, and eventually we'll be able to change the world.
I think the key issue here is probably the incentive structure, right? We need to change how scientists are getting rewarded for their science, and I personally don't vote for the impact factor, and I really agree that the whole publishing system needs to be overhauled somehow. I like to, you know, plug preprints here. Preprint servers are a great thing. But in general, I think it's the incentive system, and that needs to be, I mean, that's a multi-layered, multi-pronged problem, right? It's everywhere. It's in universities, it's in funders, organizations, and whatever else. It needs to be done, but it's just like Krista said, it's not going to be done overnight. It's not going to be done probably, you know, within the next couple of decades, but it is slowly changing, and it is a definite change that is happening, and I think it will be faster and easier the further we get with it, because I have seen a definite change in the last 3 or 4 years. There's been a definite, you know, switch in the trend towards more open, and a lot of the funders are putting demands on, like, if we're going to fund your project, then the results need to be open, otherwise we're not going to fund it. So,
and I'm going to get political for a second. You know, we at OBI, we really want to see, again, the research getting translated into meaningful impacts in patients' lives, so improving the lives of people who are living with brain disorders. And one of the challenges is, how do you get these care pathways or treatments or diagnostic tools embedded into the healthcare system? And you know, at the end of the day, it's really the patients and the people who are living in the community who are advocating for those changes, and that's ultimately, unfortunately, that's the best bang for your buck. If you can get a bunch of people conveying the same message from multiple perspectives, that's really truly the only way we're going to see change right now. And kind of using the same analogy here from the world of science, I think is probably how we're going to see some wins.
And I think I was going along that line. I was going to say, turn it upside down. So instead of saying, you know, the PIs are going to be the ones asking for open access, I think it's your general population that's going to be doing it. Talk to mother advocates, anybody, you know, who has a child with autism or anything like that, and something needs to change. There are many, many groups that run at that level, and they affect change, and they can do that. So I think that's where the focus needs to come in. And I'm going to demand change. If I'm going to put my tax dollars in there, and I think it's important for that to happen, then I want to see that open access journal. And don't tell me that I won't understand it. Then you write it in a way that it meets the needs of different audiences. Sure, you know, I'm going to be speaking to a particular group and I need to use a particular jargon, no problem there. But it also needs to be translated. But I also think that can't be done by always with one person. So there is a team required, and that has to change. But I think that needs to turn around. I think we need to to look at it in a different way. It's not the PI that's doing all that.
And there's a community aspect as well. As scientists, we advocate for it, but then when we publish, what do we choose? We choose those restricted journals, right? And that's the key. And funding bodies are saying you should share your data and you should share your paper and you should publish it. But then who do they so again, as a community, we need to say, okay, do the requirements that you're putting, are they in line with how you reward those grants? Right, so that inconsistency drives people crazy, especially young investigators, right? I'm all for open access, but then if I publish, I don't get as much impact as I did in Nature or whatever the case may be. And I think it's also an ethical issue. Tax dollars are paying for this research, and then they're locked up, and people can't use it. That's insane.
I would say, I think just going back to the original question, is just like identifying that there are those of us who are early in our career where open access and those kinds of things are actually not well incentivized, and if anything, detrimental, right, to our getting a job or getting a postdoc or whatever you're going towards. And I think part of it is on our part to try to participate, but only in open access, but only at the point where you feel that it's worth the risk to your career, right? And I think it's still okay, given the incentive structure, until the higher ups change that structure, it's okay to want to publish in Nature. And sometimes you're going to identify journals who are up and coming in open access. And this may be very political in the open science community, but for some of us, there are numerous biases still working against us too. So it's hard to live up to these very lofty goals of open access without considering kind of for each individual what we're giving up when we do that. So I think it's a very personal choice. I like certain models like eLife, for example. It's pretty high impact. It's very open access, open reviews and things like that, and they're becoming more popular. So for those of us who feel that we can publish in those places, I encourage you to, and I really like to. But otherwise, I think we have to be a little bit more pragmatic, especially those of us without that power, to recognize that we can't fully participate in this system yet.
And I think talking about open access is a little bit political or controversial. It's also, our tax dollars fund our healthcare system. That creates data. That should be easily accessible. There shouldn't be a huge barrier for us to access those databases. And Randy's laughing because it's a problem across the country. That data exists. That can inform decisions, real decisions that impact each individual, each Canadian's health, right? But how do we get access? What's the process? Is so cumbersome. So again, this is where advocacy from just the general population comes in. When you talk to your MPP and those things matter to you, then there is incentive, because there's a political incentive for them to open up those data resources. The Globe and Mail had this really great article about how these data are actually living in data jails. So that's from a data perspective, that's another thing that we need to think about when we think about open access.
Thanks. And Helena mentioned the Sage Biosystems meeting that she and I go to on occasion. If you, we'll put up some links to some of the things we talked about. It's worthwhile looking at that because they're actually covering some of these issues we talked about, not just open data for science, but open data for clinical and patient care as well. There's some great stories in there about how they've actually been able to move the needle on things like diabetes, for instance, by having healthcare data open. But I'm going to pause now, and we're probably going to stop the formal session now. We're sort of getting into science and society, which is a great topic, but it's also lunchtime, so I don't want you guys to miss out on your lunch. So I'll take the opportunity to thank our panel of speakers. Again, excellent discussions, excellent presentations, so thank you for that. Thank you, too, to the audience for your participation. I really appreciated your questions and your patience and your attention. Finally, as I mentioned and Helena mentioned, we'll have the slides and materials posted on the INCF website, training.incf.org, probably in a couple, 3 days. Also, hopefully, the video that's being taken. Tanya will be sending out an email that will have additional information, as well as she will ask you to fill in a brief survey through SurveyMonkey just to give us some ideas for when we do this again. What other information would you like to see? Is the format okay? Can you suggest other things you might want to try and do? As far as I know, this is the first of its kind in terms of the focus on science management at a scientific conference. So obviously, there's a lot of room for us to grow and learn from you. So please give us your feedback. I really appreciate it. With that, I'll thank you all again and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.